Before we start the show, I want to say a quick thank you for being a listener and to explain a little more about why my colleagues and I hope you subscribe to the Washington Post. The Post newsroom has published more than 100 scoops so far this year, exclusive stories reported by our newsroom, holding power to account and keeping you informed. That's what drives our work. And it's the kind of work that you support as a subscriber. If you're not one already, this is a great time to take the step. Our Memorial Day sale is happening right now. You can unlock your subscription for just $2 every 4 weeks for a whole year. And after that, it's just $12 every 4 weeks. You can cancel anytime. Hit pause right now and go to the subscription link in our show notes or to washingtonpost.com/subscribe. In a few minutes, you'll have more of what's happening in the world right at your fingertips. This offer is good for a limited time, so really do not wait. We're excited to welcome you as a subscriber. Okay, here's the show. When people testify in federal court, there's usually a uniform. Most witnesses are dressed in professional attire. Men take the stand wearing suits. That's been the case for most of the witnesses called in the trial of music mogul Sean Diddy Combs. Then there was rapper Kid Cudi.
He was quite a presence on the stand. I think a unique presence, certainly. He showed up to court in just like some light jeans, a white shirt, and a black leather jacket, which he wore on the stand when he was delivering his testimony.
Anne Brannigan has been reporting on the Combs trial in New York for the Post. And she was there on Thursday when the government called up their witness, Scott Mescudi, the musician also known as Kid Cudi.
So today we had another packed day of testimony. The government has been, I think, moving at a pretty fast clip. They've really been packing people in there. So the big name of the day is Kid Cudi.
This was the second week that federal prosecutors had their witnesses testify. A lot of those witnesses talked about the power Combs had over the people who worked for him and over the people he was romantically involved with. It's why Mescudi was there. He briefly dated Combs' ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. A picture emerged in court this week from what Mescudi and others said. Through their testimony, federal prosecutors tried to show the vast extent of Combs' power in his personal life and in his business. As one witness put it, it was all, quote, Mr. Combs' kingdom. From the newsroom of the Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Friday, May 23rd. Today, we're continuing our coverage of the trial of Sean Combs, also known as Diddy, Puff Daddy. We'll be bringing you episodes most Fridays, and we should note we're going to be discussing sex, drugs, and violence. Combs is charged with 5 criminal counts of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He has pleaded not guilty. If convicted, he could face up to life in prison. If you haven't been keeping up with this trial, our episode from last Friday goes over the testimony of Combs' ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. In today's episode, Anne is going to break down the other big witnesses the government is calling, how federal prosecutors are using them to build the racketeering case, and the defense's pushback. Hi, Anne.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. This is a special treat for us because usually I'm talking to you. You're in New York, I'm in DC, but you're here in the studio today because, as I understand it, jurors and people like you got let go a little early because of the Memorial Day weekend, right?
Yes, we have a nice long break. So Friday we have off, Monday we have off. So court doesn't resume until Tuesday, which means I get to record here and not in a club closet, as I've been calling my New York apartment.
Yes. Well, and last week when you and I spoke, that was a big week because It was the start of testimony in the trial, but also because we heard from Cassie Ventura. She's an R&B singer, and as we've said, she is Combs's longtime former girlfriend. She was the government's star witness so far. Can you just briefly remind us of what Ventura said last week and what she alleged?
Right. So Ventura really laid out her experiences with Combs over the course of the 11-year relationship. We heard a lot about her experience with freak-offs. These were Combs controlled, in her words, sort of events, highly choreographed, tailored to his preferences. They were born out of his interest in, quote unquote, voyeurism. And so they would involve a male escort. He would be watching and sort of saying what to do according to her testimony. And these took place in hotels, in apartments all over the U.S., LA, Miami, New York, as well as some places overseas as well.
Yeah, and she also, as I recall from our conversation, talked about Combs physically abused her and that she also became reliant on drugs because of this experience.
Exactly. So what she talked about was how she was coerced and forced to participate in these freak-offs. And that's where she really laid out the physical abuse she experienced in this relationship. She talked about the drug use. At one point, she was using them to cope with the reality of these freak-offs, she said. And so she was addicted to opiates at one point. She also talked about blackmail and financial control. And this, the way that Combs really seemed to just have a hook in all of these other aspects of her life.
And remind us, how did the defense respond to her and what she was saying?
Right. Well, over the course of an 11-year relationship, there were a lot of text exchanges, as you can imagine. And so they really pulled forward a lot of this communication and were trying to reframe Combs in a way. And so they were focusing on these caring, kind of deferential messages from Combs, these messages from Ventura that were, expressing enthusiasm for freak-offs and being a bit maybe steamy, like she was planning and proposing them. The whole point there is that they really want to emphasize, the defense does, that Ventura had agency this entire time and that she was making these choices of her own volition.
So that was last week. Now let's talk about the witnesses who testified this week. And as a reminder for listeners, we're still in the part of the trial where we're hearing the government's witnesses. So these are people that the government is calling upon to testify. We haven't gotten to the defense yet. Let's start with rapper Kid Cudi. We already mentioned him. Yeah. His real name is Scott Mescudi. We knew that he might be called this week because his name came up last week when Ventura was testifying. So what did he have to talk about on the stand?
So we got to hear his side of a story that was first sort of laid out in Cassie Ventura's 2023 lawsuit. So he talked about an incident in which his Porsche was exploded.
Like blown up?
Yes. Apparently it was cut open and a Molotov cocktail was thrown in it. Now, this is a Porsche 911 Cabriolet.
Oh my gosh.
So we got to hear his side of the story. Apparently, he was away when it happened, but he was alerted to it by a dog sitter.
So why does his car being blown up have anything to do with John Combs?
Because what Ventura has alleged, what the government is alleging, is that Combs was behind this event and that it was because he was jealous of the relationship that Mescudi and Ventura had been having.
So they started dating, and then Mescudi is saying Combs was jealous and he blew up my very expensive vehicle.
Exactly. So the relationship took place in 2011. The car explosion happened in early 2012. So when Ventura talked about this, it was as sort of like a threat, as a warning, not as a, intent to actually hurt him, but to intimidate him.
I see. And has Sean Combs ever said anything about this alleged arson incident?
He's always denied it. And on the, under cross-examination, his defense really leaned into the fact that, Combs's fingerprints weren't found. The fact that the arson happened is clear, but they're trying to introduce doubt about, well, is there anybody else who could have done it?
I see.
Trying to create some distance there. Really leaning into the fact that, how much evidence is actually tying him to this incident.
Did he talk about anything else related to Combs?
Yeah, so we got to hear a lot more of, his perception of things. We got to hear about an incident that wasn't really talked about before, which was this alleged break-in that happened before the Molotov cocktail incident with the car. And so this happened the same day that Combs found out about Ventura's and Mescuddy's relationship, right? So what Mescuddy laid on the stand was that Ventura calls him in a panic, and then shortly thereafter, they receive a call from an assistant of Combs. And she relays to them that she is sitting outside of Mescuddy's home and that Combs and an associate are inside of Mescuddy's home.
Combs himself?
Yes, and an associate, according to this assistant.
Okay.
Right.
And what are they doing in his house?
That's the big question, right? So Mescuddy, he calls up Combs. He uses some profane language. She's like, mother,
Okay.
You in my home.
Fill in the blanks there. Got it.
Calls Combs, heads over to his house. By the time he goes to his house, there's nobody there, but he does see that the security cameras, which are normally sort of trained on the door, they've been turned away. He goes in, it's around Christmas time. He had gotten Chanel gifts for his family. Those had been kind of opened and rifled through and were on the kitchen counter.
Wait, so his Christmas presents were opened?
Yes, rifled through, opened in some way. The thing here might be actually sort of Mescuddy's dog, who apparently was locked in a bathroom when Mescuddy arrived home. Now, He said on the stand, his dog normally has free reign of the house, and he didn't close that bathroom door before he left. He was very certain about that. And that the dog was agitated and anxious.
Okay, so he's talking about these two incidents, and then I'm curious, how did Mescuddy describe his relationship with Ventura? So they dated.
Right. So they dated, were working together on some music. They fell in love. He described Ventura on the stand as, a fun person to be around, like somebody he, fell in love with. Ventura, she said that she and Mescuddy got together during a off period between her and Combs.
So they were on and off.
Right. And that was Mescuddy's understanding, was that they were off. During this period, Ventura does disclose that Combs was physically abusive toward her. She did not share anything about sexual abuse, according to him. So something that came out too that was quite vivid in Mescuddy's sort of recollection, right, was this meeting at the Soho house that happens after the Porsche explosion, right? Because this is getting out of hand. He calls a meeting with Combs just to, squash it before it can escalate. They meet up, and Mescuddy here actually compared Combs to a Marvel supervillain. He just said,
Wow, on the stand he said that.
Yes, he was looking like a Marvel supervillain. So it's during this meeting that Combs and Mescuddy hash it out a little bit. And Combs says, apparently, I thought we were homies. You knew that was my girl. Mescuddy is like, actually, she told me you weren't together. Ventura came in at some point, explained that her and Mescuddy had fallen in love and things just happened. And everything is pretty much sort of copacetic, right? But there is an exchange that happens at the end, which is he and Combs go in for a handshake. And Mescuddy wanted to look him in the eye and ask him, what are we going to do about my car? But he says that Combs gave him this cold stare and just said, I don't know what you're talking about, right? And Mescuddy felt that Combs was lying to him. That's where Mescuddy's testimony more or less ends. Apparently, years later, again, at that same Soho house, Combs apologizes for, quote, everything, not specifying what.
What the everything was, yeah.
Right. Obviously, a lot of what Mescuddy says is under the government questioning. When the defense comes up, they start probing a little bit more about Mescuddy's feelings about that overlap. They're really prompting the witnesses when they're trying to get this information.
Yeah, and the overlap between the dating.
Exactly. And so they prompt him to say, well, did this woman play you guys? And Mescuddy says that he believes that she did. And so it it's this moment where Ventura is portrayed as maybe like a little bit duplicitous, or again, like
dating two guys at once.
Having control, I think, is really what that goes to, which is what the defense really wants to emphasize, is that she had agency. She made choices. She chose to be this with Mescudi and then did not. That sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at Mescudi's testimony, both under government questioning and defense questioning, what big takeaways did you have from that testimony as far as its relevancy to the case?
So in the racketeering count, they mentioned arson, and that arson relates back to the car incident, right? So in that way, Mescudi is part of that big racketeering charge.
And who else who was close to Ventura was called to testify this week? And what did those witnesses reveal about her relationship with Combs?
So this week, we really got a lot of people corroborating Ventura's side of the story. So we heard from her ex-best friend of 17 years, Carrie Morgan. We heard from her mother, Regina Ventura. And we also heard from another friend, a makeup artist called Myla Morales. And all of these women described, physical injuries or abuse that they witnessed between Combs and Ventura. I think Regina Ventura had a really striking, to me, story about how Combs asked her for $20,000. And this was in that 2011 Christmas time period, right, where Combs is allegedly, enraged about this revelation that Ventura is dating Mescudi. And he asked Ventura's mother to pay him $20,000, which is the money he estimates he spent on Cassie Ventura, and would like to be reimbursed back. And so she does wire him this money. And Ventura said on the stand that she actually took out a home equity loan in this amount in order to pay Combs. And this is after she has found out that this man has also been physically assaulting her daughter. Cassie Ventura also disclosed that, he was making threats. And so she pays Combs this money, but he ultimately returns it very shortly after.
Okay.
And so, to be clear, the defense does not deny that the wiring of that money happened, that the ask was made, that the money was returned. Interestingly, they did not cross-examine her.
Yeah, how did the defense handle these witnesses who were corroborating Ventura's testimony about being abused?
Right. In the case of Regina Ventura, there's no follow-up questioning there. They did talk quite a bit more to Carrie Morgan and Myla Morales. They wanted to portray Ventura as, successful and thriving in her career to kind of counter that argument that, she was being stifled or controlled by Combs. So they're asking her a lot about her career, how well Ventura was doing. There was a moment with Morales who described, a pretty intense assault, right? And seeing the injuries on Cassie Ventura. The government asks, why didn't you call police? Morales apparently called a doctor friend to come over and check Cassie Ventura and see whether she had a concussion. And Morales said, one, Ventura didn't want to do these things, but also I didn't want to do these things because I was scared for my life. Basically trying to say that if Combs could do this to Cassie Ventura, what could Combs do to her, right? Now, the question you asked was how the defense treats sort of a story like this.
Yeah.
And the thing that they ask her is basically like, well, did Sean Combs ever follow up with you? Did an associate ever follow up with you, approach you about what happened, right? And Morales said, no one ever did. And so trying to undercut that fear that she said she felt.
Or trying to infer like it's unreasonable and not based on anything, just like...
Exactly.
Exactly. See. And so what is the version of events that the defense is presenting around these incidents?
Right. Well, at this point in the trial, because it's the government presenting its case, what they're really doing and what they're really focusing on is poking holes in the government's arguments, really poking holes in the testimony, just trying to undermine the government's version of events. And they will present their version once the prosecution is done. So in the last 2 weeks of trial, then we'll get to really hear their account of what happened.
I see. After the break, we hear from the people who worked for Combs, what they saw and what they did for Combs's, quote, kingdom. We'll be right back.
I'm Sally Jenkins, and I'm a sports columnist and feature writer for The Washington Post. My job entails pulling the curtain on really big sports events, at what is going on in locker rooms, what's going on in the stadium tunnel, most importantly, what's going on in the minds of the athletes that I cover. I think that we have an instinct that sports are really important in some primal way. We pay a lot of money for them. We build really big stadiums for them. And I think that athletics really gets us in touch with aspiration and teach something very, very important about accountability, about self-determination. And so my job is to really make those links explicit for readers and users. Subscriptions support this work and the people behind it. Find out more at subscribe.washingtonpost.com. I'm Sally Jenkins, and I'm one of the people behind the Post.
So those were people who testified who were just like people who were close to Ventura. But last week she testified about how Combs had employees like assistants and security who helped him run his business, but also saw him being violent toward her and would also be the ones to like buy drugs and buy supplies for these like sex party freak-offs. And this seems to relate, at least in part, to the racketeering conspiracy charge, because that's all about, you using your business to commit crimes, basically. So did any of these people, Combs's employees or former employees, testify this week? And what did they have to say?
Yeah, so we heard from two men who used to be assistants to Sean Combs, David James at the beginning of the week, and then George Kaplan. So the portrait that these assistants painted with their testimony was of, these long hours that they had to work, sometimes weeks on ends, like really being at Combs's beck and call, running all of these errands, procuring drugs for him, buying freak-off supplies, having to prep hotel rooms, clean hotel rooms up. They were threatened with their jobs, occasionally, describing sort of being in this world as this all-encompassing thing that really revolved around Combs.
So Combs's assistant, David James, did he sort of describe what it was even like to work for Combs?
So there's this interesting tension here where he describes it as like a dream job. He's trying to break into fashion, Sean Combs, he has the Sean John fashion line. He's already this icon in the eyes of many people, right? And so he's really excited to work for Sean Combs, but it's also very clear that it's a demanding job and that it completely revolves around Combs. And he knows this because when he was interviewing for it, he's told by, an executive HR person, right? The head of HR at Combs's company, she waves to a picture of Combs that's on the wall and says, "This is Mr. Combs's kingdom. We're here to serve in it," is, essentially what he described.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you talk about these two former assistants and the types of things that they were doing, engaging in behavior that is illegal. So why are they not being charged with these crimes? Why is Combs the one on trial here?
Right. So with Kaplan in particular, we saw him get basically what's called an order of immunity right before he testified. And it basically means he was given immunity for his testimony. So he won't be charged for some of the things that he participated in. Now, he can still be charged if he lies on the stand. He's not excused from that.
Okay, so he can still be charged with perjury if he lies on the stand.
Yes.
But I guess I wonder, like, the fact that he's granted immunity, does that undercut the credibility of his testimony at all? Like, if you give this testimony, then you won't be charged with these crimes.
Well, it cuts both ways. Like, in some ways, it should not undercut his testimony because the only thing he's being asked to do now is be honest, to be completely transparent about everything that went down. But there are some people who see that, and they could be members of the jury who feel really uncomfortable with that, that feel like that's unfair to Combs, right?
Yeah. Did you get the sense that they wanted to testify? Like, why were they testifying?
Oh, Kaplan was very forthcoming about the fact that he did not want to testify. He was there because he was subpoenaed by the government, and he said that was why he was there. He did not offer information. He wasn't raising his hand to testify at this trial. He did it because he was
subpoenaed.
Exactly.
And then you have to testify.
Exactly.
So I want to also ask about another sort of category of people who testified. And this week, the prosecution had law enforcement agents come and also just people who provided expert testimony in the case. So let's talk about the law enforcement agents. Who were they and why were they testifying? What did they say?
So we heard from a special agent who participated in the raid of Combs's Miami homes that took place in March 2024.
And this is what came before the charges.
Exactly. And so he described, they found AR-15 parts in Sean Combs's home. They found dozens of bottles of baby oil, lubricant, all the things that we've been hearing about from before. They found that at his home, right?
And then we also mentioned expert witnesses, and these are people called in to provide like another layer of context. Who testified and what did they say?
So we've had only one sort of expert witness so far for the government, and that's Dawn Hughes. She's a forensic psychologist, and she was there as what's called a blind witness. So she hadn't talked to Cassie Ventura. She hadn't talked to Sean Combs. She wasn't there to diagnose them. She wasn't told any facts of the case. So she was there to deliver just sort of this broad testimony about domestic violence and what the literature says, right? What, the consensus in the field is about victims of domestic violence and how they respond to things, what their behavior is. The government very much wants jurors to sort of piece those parts together when Hughes talks about, for example, that it's easier to talk about abuse when it's a stranger who does it to you than if it's somebody you know. It is harder to escape control from somebody the more kinds of abuse you experience from them.
I see. So all this is relevant to the case. And so how did the defense talk to her and cross-examine her?
Yeah, it was quite drawn out, I think maybe unexpectedly. I would say the one thing that stood out on cross-examination was when they asked if she had ever testified on behalf of somebody who was accused of domestic violence, right? Because she has a clinical practice, but she did admit that 60% of her income does come from testifying in these cases.
Income because she's getting paid as an expert
to
testify. So they talked about that?
Yeah, so she gets paid $6,000 a day for her testimony. That was her rate.
Wow.
Current rate, yeah. Yes.
Okay, so was this important to underscore? I guess I'm just wondering, the defense, they're arguing this stuff for these jurors. So I'm wondering how this sounds to the jurors.
So again, this is something that could cut both ways because the government actually asked her about her rate during their questioning. Maybe they were trying to get ahead of the defense.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're paying her a lot of money to do this.
Yeah, but also asking her if she has a financial incentive in the outcome of the trial. So basically, she's getting paid for this testimony either way. Whether or not Sean Combs gets convicted, there was no financial incentive for her there. It's not like she gets a bonus.
Based on the outcome of the case.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think this is important to underscore, too, because people should know that typically in a criminal trial, witnesses who are subpoenaed they're not getting any money for this. But if the government is paying someone, and the defense might pay expert witnesses too. So it's like, this is like normal, but I'm just wondering, like, out there in the like court of public opinion, like, does that, how that plays?
I think there's just like a lot of confusion about stuff like that because we also tend to conflate, I think, the civil process and the criminal process, which are very different.
Yeah.
But yes, as you said, most of these witnesses are not getting paid to testify, and there is no financial incentive for them.
Anne, it's only the second week of testimony. And as I said before, we're just hearing from government witnesses so far. So it's hard to know, like, where this case stands, whether it's going in Sean Combs's favor or not. But just when you look at this week, how did the government do in building their case against Combs, and how did the defense respond? If you were to sort of just like step back and think about that for a moment.
I think the government managed to successfully sort of corroborate a lot of things around Cassie Ventura's testimony. I think they have laid out vividly, this story of physical abuse, how that registers with the jury. I'm genuinely curious about, because the whole thing that, Sean Combs's defense is trying to argue is that physical abuse existed, but it was not enough to coerce Cassie Ventura or anybody else, right? That all the people in Sean Combs's orbit, they were doing it because they wanted to work for him, because they wanted to be in this field, that they had stuff to gain from doing this. And so kind of undercutting, that argument of control and coercion, right? But I don't know if it's been enough to convince 12 people so far.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for, joining me in the studio today to lay all this out. And I'll be talking to you next Friday.
Sounds good. Talk to you then.
Talk to you then. Anne Brannigan is a reporter for the Style section of The Post. Listeners, if you have any thoughts, questions about the trial, what you're hearing from us, what you're reading or seeing online, let us know. Send an email or a voice memo to postreports@washpost.com. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Sabby Robinson, who also contributed reporting from New York. It was edited by Rena Flores. It was mixed by Sean Carter. Thanks to Carlos Bardos. If you love our show, please consider subscribing to The Post. Again, it's the perfect time to subscribe with our Memorial Day sale. Our team includes Martine Powers, Colby Ickowitz, Maggie Penman, Ted Muldoon, Lucy Perkins, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Rennie Svirnovsky, Emma Taukoff, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, and Renita Jablonski. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.